This week, the Biden administration tells the Border Patrol not to misgender illegal border crossers. Teachers' unions are bagging big cash while teachers and students are left to fend for themselves. And Catholic schools head to court for fair treatment under the law in multiple states. These stories and much more coming up on The Lion Week in Review.
Welcome in to this week's edition of The Lion Week in Review. It's a weekly look at the culture, the courts, your state capitol, and your kids. I'm Chris Stigall. Now, let's meet our panel, some of the men and women behind the stories at readlion.com. Michael Ryan is the executive editor at The Lion, Josh Mann, the managing editor, and Jillian Schneider, staff writer at The Lion. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad you could be here today. Jillian, I want to start with you. There's an interesting story out of Seattle. You do quite a bit of correspondence for The Lion, places, particularly the West Coast, which always seems to be a hotbed of activity. But this is a particularly interesting one. The group Moms for Liberty. They're accused now, and I guess they're being perhaps, sued by either kids in the school district, parents, or teachers in the LGBTQ scene. Can you explain?
Yeah, so the story is that kind of at the behest of their teacher, a group of middle school students sent letters to Moms for Liberty, kind of accusing them of being anti-LGBTQ, anti-gay, and these offensive cards, really. And I think that it's indicative of what's going on in our world, which is that the left and particularly public school teachers have this really anti-parent and anti-family agenda that's becoming pervasive in our schools.
So Josh, the cards specifically, what did they say? What's the objection?
Well, they were really beautifully designed, I'll say, but here were some of the comments. Moms for Liberty, with a broken heart, rainbow heart that says, "My heart when people are homophobic, stop." Dear Moms for Liberty, stop bullying and excluding LGBTQ plus youth and families. Another says, "Gay is slay, stop being a rat." So the teacher who she wrote a letter to Moms for Liberty and included these cards in it. And she signed her name as a GSA director, but it's unclear. And our reporter asked, and they didn't answer, when did these kids make these cards? Was it in class? Was it a GSA meeting? Was this after school? So we don't know, but we do know that the teacher seemed to help spearhead it and enable it. The cards were sarcastic, and our reporter who emailed the teacher got an auto reply that said she's on a leave of absence.
Oh, wow.
So it appears that maybe there's been some kind of action taken, or maybe an investigation.
See, now I didn't fully comprehend the story, Michael, but this was unsolicited then. This was not in reaction to something Moms for Liberty did. This was just that Moms for Liberty exists, apparently.
Yeah, which is a terrible thing, obviously. I mean,
right.
I'm waiting for the group Moms Against Liberty to spout out. Moms for Liberty is an organization that was founded to protect parental rights. It was founded by a couple of mothers who were on a school board, and they saw behind the scenes in the educational establishment before the rest of the country did during the pandemic. And so they started this organization, and it spread like wildfire. They're now in 47 states.
Wow.
47 states. And they saw, as school board members, they saw parents wanting to advocate for their kids, wanting to stand up to the educational bureaucracy, wanting to engage with school districts, but didn't know how. And so they thought they felt kind of obligated to help parents really learn how to engage.
I mean, the growing influence of that group, as you point out, I assume that's the objection. Maybe I shouldn't assume, but I assume the objection is the growing influence of Moms for Liberty. Jillian, is that about right? I mean, people feel threatened by this group.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think if they weren't having such a big influence, people wouldn't be so, afraid of them or be targeting them so virulently. So absolutely.
Well, and they just won the Patriot Award, from Fox News.
Oh, that's right.
And, at the awards, they made the point that we can't let the government get in between parents and kids. I don't think that's a radical sentiment.
And imagine if a teacher, let's reverse the roles. Imagine if a teacher had their students or part of a student club write letters to the Southern Poverty Law Center about something that seemed conservative. There would be an outcry in the legacy media, I would think, and from the left. And so if you just plug this in the other way, it doesn't work. And yet, I don't know if there's enough outrage.
You guys at the Lion are so great at, as we talk about covering culture too, and it's not, education exclusive. We talk a lot about education issues, but one of the things you've been covering is what's going on at the border, of all things, Michael. Border Patrol agents now being asked to use preferred pronouns to people that cross the border illegally. Is this right?
Yes, it is. And, we had, just as an example, over 160 illegal immigrants in the last fiscal year just ended that were on the terror watch list. And thank goodness, as I understand it, none of them have been misgendered. And maybe we ought to go back over the list of the 9/11 hijackers to see if we misgendered any of them.
That's important.
God forbid that happen. And this is going on not just with the Border Patrol, but in Health and Human Services and other federal agencies. This has become a real priority of the Biden administration to make sure that people aren't misgendered at work or crossing the border for that matter.
Well, sure. The border, as if the Border Patrol, Jillian, doesn't have enough to deal with. Now they've got to think about gender identification.
Yeah, and I think it really shows that sections of the Biden administration are really disconnected from what is important to everyday Americans. If you think of the fentanyl crisis or the drug crisis, or even just the fact that, immigrant children are coming in and overwhelming public school systems, especially in cities like New York, where they just don't have the space or they don't have the teachers to help those students. And so all of these problems that we could be dealing with, and yet the Biden administration is focusing on something that really is not relevant, I think, to most Americans or to education, or really just to everyday American people.
Yeah, can you imagine walking over the border and saying, my name is Michael, I'm from Latveria, my pronouns are he, him, his.
Josh, you guys, it seems like the Biden administration keeps you guys busy at the Lion. Their executive branch offices are constantly handing down directives like this.
Yeah, that's right. We've talked a little bit in the past, we've written about in the past an issue with the federal free and reduced lunch program, where we're seeing directives or pressure put on schools to adopt new anti-discrimination policies that are progressive in their outlook. And some schools are passing them reluctantly because their councils are actually telling them, it would just be easier to pass this and avoid lawsuits. And so sadly, it's an effective way to make policy, and the Biden administration has no problem doing it.
Jillian, you have written pretty extensively a couple of different stories, actually, but I know you know well Oregon and the state of education in Oregon. On a show that I had hosted here recently, I was doing a little research into Oregon schools and the performance there. Not good. Student test scores are really poor. But teachers' unions there are quite strong, and they're striking in many cases, like in Portland. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the teachers' union in Oregon might be coming to the close of their strike, but it's been going on for, I think, 3 or 4 weeks now, and students have been out of school for basically the entire month of November. And on top of that, they've already suffered learning loss during the pandemic. They're repealing the reading standards for third graders, which is a terrible thing to just pass third graders through whether or not they can read. And it would be one thing if the teachers' unions had something legitimate to strike about, but what they're asking for is racial equity trainings, restorative justice. They want less testing. They want to create housing funds for students that are having difficulty finding housing, their families.
Did I not hear, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, did I not hear that the legislature, many in the legislature, are trying to do away with testing metrics altogether in Oregon? Or have you heard that? I thought I read that here recently, as a matter of fact.
I'm not sure about that, although I do believe that they're doing away with high school, having to test out of high school.
That's right.
So basically you can graduate without having to prove that you've actually learned anything, which of course makes the whole public school system seem unnecessary.
Well, that's right, Michael. I mean, that doesn't do much for a teachers union to do away with any kind of metrics for high school graduation requirement. I mean, what's your argument as a teachers union if you have no metrics to measure?
Well, my argument is it's the only way I escaped high school. So, I'm probably the wrong person to ask about that. Well, let's just extrapolate this out. I'm not averse to getting somebody in a picket line to do your bidding. There was a newspaper that I was working at that was being picketed, and I had one of the people carry a sign that said, "Ryan needs a raise, he's your best." So I've done that. I've been there. But let's extrapolate this out. Just what would happen if the UAW threatened car dealers that if they don't walk the picket lines, such and such is going to happen, or car buyers for that matter? I mean, this is mafia-style pressure they're putting on kids, not adults, kids.
And Josh, the legislature, some other members of the legislature are actually trying to intervene and say, we're not going to allow teacher strikes anymore. I mean, I don't know, I guess if you're talking private sector, it's a far different matter, obviously, than public sector. Taxpayer-paid teachers, I guess, would be the argument of the legislature.
Yeah, and so I think really the bottom line is they're seeing the harm that this has done to the kids, because the kids were out of school. A tentative deal has been reached, and so the kids came back to class yesterday, or Monday in a delayed start, and they had been out since November 1st. That's a lot of class time those kids are missing. And think about the parents, the families who all of a sudden have to make arrangements if maybe they weren't at home or they have younger kids. And so I think these lawmakers, 3 of them, said, we have to do something legislatively to prevent this from happening. Some critics noted they had all summer to negotiate. And we see this every August and September. In August, we see threats emerge of a strike, and then they strike near the beginning of school, or sometimes it happens in January, and it really puts people in a bind. And so I think the lawmakers are simply wanting to add some kind of legal mechanism to prevent this from happening.
The one thing they're not, sorry, go ahead, please.
And if I may add, a lot of states actually do already have laws either restricting or prohibiting teachers' union strikes. So this isn't something new that Oregon is suggesting. Actually, a lot of states have this already. So it might be viewed as, it might be this kind of ultra-conservative agenda, but it's really not that. Oregon is actually one of the few states that doesn't already have a law like this on the books.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh, that's very interesting. And by the way, from coast to coast, you guys cover many teachers' unions. Maryland, Jillian, another story that you guys are following at the Lion right now is the amount of money that's been taken in by, is it the Maryland State Education Association?
Yes.
Tell us more.
Yeah, that's the state teachers union, and what was revealed by an organization called Project Baltimore is that union has a budget that they get primarily from teachers of $26 million, and they spend $17 million of that on their own employees. They have less than 100 employees, and their top dogs are making more than $250,000 a year. And when we even look at their expenses, they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on things like travel and other things that just have nothing to do with actually helping schools.
17 employees, is that what you said?
17 million on less than 100 employees.
17 million
so
on less than 100,
the average salary at the Maryland State Teachers Union is $180,000 a year. So these are union employees who are making well over 6 figures and not really showing any benefit to kids in Maryland. Only half of the kids can read, less than 20% can do math. It's just atrocious.
Michael, that's about what you were making when you were in the newspaper business.
Yeah,
right?
I really don't want to talk about that. But I mean, that's quite a bit of haul there.
It is.
But it probably didn't fall under the umbrella of anything for the kids.
No, I mean, maybe we should go work for a teachers union.
It's not really getting to the kids at that point, right?
Not at all.
I mean, it's not like it's going to the teachers to put stuff in their classrooms or anything
No,
like that.
it's not benefiting teachers or students. And then that's the real problem is that, teachers unions are meant to advocate for teachers, and they're not even doing that, let alone helping the kids.
Yeah, are they not, though, and this is something, you get into right to work debates, I know, in many states. Are those teachers not compelled to pay into that fund, Josh? I don't know that we know Maryland's rules on that, but do these teachers, must they pay into the fund that is then spent on these?
Well, my understanding is that there's been some relief in terms of laws in many states. I don't know specifically about Maryland, but teachers that we've talked to, teachers that I personally know, have often said when they show up first day as a teacher, one example, a family member said he was handed two slips of paper. Which union do you want to pick? Because you might get sued. And that's the idea. And I think a lot of teachers sign up because they want some protection, legal protection. And so there might be a good motive. And I don't think most of them know that that these unions pay their top employees big money. They almost exclusively donate to Democrat campaigns and support a lot of progressive liberal policies. And
you'd have to wonder what the striking Portland teachers would think of the Maryland State Association, Education Association, right, and their budget.
Well, and I wonder where that money comes from. All that money, what was the total amount?
26 million is their annual budget, give or take. And I believe, I don't know what percentage of it comes from union dues, but union dues are $300 a year per person, so a substantial amount. And the union throughout its existence has also amassed, I want to say, $45 million in investments and sort of funds. So it's clearly kind of made itself its own power, and it's not for the teachers, it's for itself.
My wife was a public school teacher for about a decade, and I know one of the things that, like you say, Josh, when she was a new teacher, one of the ways they would compel teachers to give to these education funds, these education associations, was, hey, if you ever get into legal trouble, you'll need us. It was always this, I mean, that was the way you would compel a new teacher. You may get sued someday, and you're going to need us.
And there are alternatives, and we've written a few stories about alternatives or other kinds of basically organizations where you can get some legal protection. If you're a teacher who does not want to participate in what many critics call a corrupt and obviously politicized organization, there are alternatives, and search for that at readline.com. And I think it also points to this whole economy of education. We spend so much money in this country on education, and people are asking how much of that actually makes it to the classroom, how and to what extent are kids actually being helped, and it's a good question.
Michael, one of the stories at the Lion, this is, we've seen it certainly over the weeks since the Hamas attack on Israel. The anti-Semitism, the ugly, ugly scourge of anti-Semitism is bubbling up again, and it's bubbling up in academia. It's bubbling up even amongst high school kids. It's almost unfathomable to me that kids in K through 12 would already be taught or driven to be anti-Israel. But that seems to be the case with this story. A teacher who came out in support of Israel, and her students turned on her?
Yeah. She just, she went to a pro-Israel rally, had a sign supporting Israel, and posted, a picture of herself doing that on social media. And then she was hounded by this mob of students, and it's really a frightening scene.
In her own school.
In her own school, and even the New York Police Department's counterterrorism unit had to be called in.
Man.
And it was very eerily similar to the incident in October at Cooper Union in Manhattan, where some Jewish students were put upon by a mob there, and they were trapped in the college library for half an hour or so.
This feels, Jillian, a lot like COVID. It sort of shines a light. Something this dramatic shines a light on something maybe we don't always see, but is clearly bubbling out there. This strain of anti-Semitism that I get is being taught? I mean, I don't want to put it on public schools, but where are kids this young learning this kind of viciousness?
I think it really comes from just the fact that, I think you're right, for a long time our country has been moving this way, but it's really been coming to a head in the past couple of years that kids that aren't taught but conservative values, history, to have religious values, just to have some of these fundamental basics, because there are a lot of things we can disagree on, especially in the political realm, but there are some basics that we need to have and ought to have, and that these kids aren't getting that. And so they're like a ship without an anchor, and they just get tossed by every wave of ideology that comes crashing at them.
Is it fair to say this is the first TikTok generation?
I think my generation, I'm 23, and I think mine is the social media generation. I was probably 6 years old when the iPod came out, probably 9 or 10 when the iPhone. So I don't know existence without social media, and then that sort of thing. Like, that's part of our life. And yeah, you're right.
And they're not getting news from the Wall Street Journal. Let's put it that way.
No.
Is that, I mean, to your point, is that where this comes from? Because I don't want to be unfair. Do you think this is just something that has flooded social media and young people's minds, or is it something they're taught?
I think that it is the fact that, yes, that they get it from other sources as well, but that we've tried to force public schools to be neutral on these issues. And, the phrase that people on the left tend to use is separation of church and state. But I think that has been misunderstood, and what they're interpreting it now is that we can't have any religion. They're essentially not, that's not what the founding fathers meant, that we would have no religion in society. And that's what's happening now, is that schools, being these supposedly neutral entities, are really getting caught up in all of this ideology. And so, not all teachers agree with it, I'm sure, but the fact is that they can't do much to resist it because they're kind of stuck as these public employees, not being able to speak out.
This is where you see a lot of public school teachers, Josh, leaving, entering private sector teaching, Christian schools or what have you, or starting their own micro schools. It's unthinkable to me that a teacher supporting Israel in her private time would lead to a student rebellion in her own classroom. By the way, it makes me think of the teachers' unions that we were just talking about a minute ago. I mean, I wonder where the help is for someone like this.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully if she's part of a union, I would hope they would have come to her support. But the issues become so politicized, and I think another sort of subcurrent in the whole thing is this idea of victimhood that gets emphasized in schools, that there are certain people who are victims and therefore need to be somehow lifted up, and their so-called oppressors brought down. And in the whole Israel-Palestine narrative, we've seen a lot, especially in the media and in some higher institutions of higher learning, where they're essentially labeling Israel as some kind of aggressor, occupier, etc., and so then Palestine becomes the victim. And so I wonder sometimes with a mob like this, hundreds of students, how many of them really are passionate about the so-called plight of the Palestinians? I mean, probably very few. So I think sometimes the mob mentality just becomes
fashionable.
It's fashionable, it's politicized, somebody's viewed as somehow being oppressed, and so you just jump on it.
Yeah, and it's easy to do to go off on fly off the handle when you don't have information. The old saying is nature abhors a vacuum, and if you're not getting these moral values, maybe at home, certainly not in school, then that void is going to be filled by something else, TikTok, other sources of information that don't bring the history or the fairness or the acknowledgement that there is right and wrong, good and evil, and you don't have to be neutral, and you shouldn't be neutral when it comes to good and evil.
You have been covering pretty extensively at the Lion, Josh, the story of Oklahoma, and specifically what they're trying to do, first in the country, to my knowledge, what they're trying to do with some Catholic schools. I'd kind of like to use that. It's not specifically the story, but I'd like for you, if you could, to kind of explain the dynamic, what's going on there right now with their governor and the opposition there.
Sure. So Oklahoma is the first state to essentially approve a religious charter school. Now, it's a virtual charter school, and they have a virtual charter school board in the state. And so a diocese applied for charter school approval for this school, St. Isidore, and was eventually approved after some work. And the governor is in support of it, Governor Stitt, and the superintendent of public instruction, Ryan Walters, has also been in support of it. Their attorney general, however, and all of these people have R's by their names, but the attorney general has opposed it. There is some evidence and speculation in the state that there's a little bit of a feud, and that the attorney general has his sights set on the governor's seat. So I don't know how much that may play into it, but essentially he's argued, and then many on the left have argued, that it's unconstitutional to have a charter school which would be publicly funded that also has some religious affiliation. However, the superintendent, the governor, and many who have, so the AG sued, but many have come out in support, even legally, of the state's case that no, this charter school is constitutional. And what their argument is that the Constitution would forbid you from discriminating against such a charter school if they're religious.
So that's the conservative argument, Michael, that you can't not give public funds to a Catholic charter school, because if you're saying, well, you're Catholic, you don't deserve public funds, that unto itself is discrimination. Is that about right?
Yeah, and it's not just the conservative argument, it's the Supreme Court's argument. You know, a few years ago, a church in Missouri applied for a grant for a new playground surface that was open to anybody else, and they were denied. And this case went all the way to Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice said, you cannot deny public benefits to an organization that's religious simply because it's religious. And certainly education is a public benefit.
So this is, Jillian, a way that, well, in this case it's a Catholic school, but you could argue that anybody that wanted to start a Christian school under that argument would have access to public funds.
Absolutely. And one of the arguments that Superintendent Ryan Walters has made that I think is really important is, like I mentioned earlier, the opponents always argue, well, separation of church and state. But we have to understand that, you know, that any school, whether it's religious explicitly or not, has a worldview. And so really what we see in public schools is not neutrality. What we see is state-sponsored atheism or another religion, essentially. And so, you know, I don't, you know, agree with some of the things they teach in public schools, and yet my public dollars go to them. So why do we have to agree? And so I think the question is, well, is religion acceptable in the public sphere? Can we have Christianity? Is that something that the government has to oppose? And of course, the question is no. Our founding fathers guaranteed us religious freedom and said that people could, and the government specifically, couldn't discriminate against religious groups.
Yes, and on this one, the government needs to be neutral, has to be neutral.
Josh, you guys have covered the map today, it seems. Michigan, while we're on the subject specifically of Catholic schools in Michigan, you've got a story working at the Lion.
Yeah, that's right. So a Catholic school there has sued, accusing state officials of essentially violating their religious liberty. So the state wants to essentially require the Catholic school to adopt hiring practices that are, in the state's view, anti-discriminatory. And yet traditional Catholic teaching would hold that certain traditional views of marriage, for example. And so this school would want to hire teachers who agree with that viewpoint and essentially are feeling like the state is saying, no, that's illegal. You can't do that. So they're suing.
This is almost the reverse of the argument in Oklahoma, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And this isn't the only school. We've seen schools across the country have had to do this. We've in various ways. Sometimes it's a preschool who, in order to participate in a state program, we covered something in Colorado along these lines, they need to all of a sudden adopt new hiring policies. Mm-hmm. And usually these religious institutions win. But this is, I think, another example of why the court system is so important and that some of these religious liberty cases are so important.
So let me play devil's advocate, Michael Ryan. Someone who says, well, now you want to have it both ways. You say that a Catholic school can't be denied public funds, but now you're saying, well, you're a religious institution and you shouldn't be held to the same hiring standards as the rest of the state.
Well, in this case, it's not a matter of policies and procedures. This is an existential question for religious organizations. If religious organizations can't hire or can't be allowed to exclude people who don't buy in to their particular religious principles, then it's no longer a religious institution. And under that, religious institutions die.
So, Jillian, you can't, in other words, said another way, you can't discriminate against them for being a religious institution, but you can't force them to conform as a religious institution. Is that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's important to note is that in many of the anti-discriminatory laws in our nation, there are specific exemptions for religious groups because they recognize that, people have a right to exercise their religious beliefs as they see fit. And so what is happening at these schools is that they're being really put in a bind where they can't be public schools, but they also aren't even allowed to be private Christian schools because they're, the government is trying to force them into the ideology. And that's really the most chilling thing, is not just that there are these opposing viewpoints, but that one of these viewpoints is being forced indiscriminately on everybody, regardless of what they believe and regardless of whether that viewpoint is actually true.
Fantastic stuff. Panel, great conversation today. Thanks for joining us. That's going to do it for this week's edition of the Lion Week in Review. Be sure to keep up to date on all the latest news every day at readlion.com. For all of us at the Lion, thanks for downloading the show. See you next time.